In the secluded town of Coldwater, time moved as slowly as the river winding its way through the silent pines. Life here was tucked neatly under layers of routine and tradition, and the townsfolk, as they always had, kept their lives simple, bound by respect for the quiet and the wild. Days passed predictably. Shopkeepers setting up their wares at dawn, school children heading home as dusk approached, and the church bell marking the evening hour like a call to sanctuary. But as the weeks crept toward winter, that familiar quiet grew heavier, gathering in the alleys and along the forest edge where Coldwater met the shadows. The first strange sighting happened, as many strange things do, on a fog-thickened night. Samuel Wright, the old caretaker of the church, swore he'd seen a child standing alone under the streetlight by the town square, her figure ghostly against the silver mist. She stood with her head lowered, hands hanging loosely at her sides, the light casting long shadows that seemed to bleed into the fog. He squinted, leaning on his cane, and took a step toward her, calling out, "Are you lost, little one?" The child did not move, did not flinch or startle. She simply tilted her head, her gaze lifting slowly until her face met his. Samuel stopped dead, his breath catching. Her eyes, bottomless, dark as storm clouds, stared back at him, unblinking, as if she were peering into something deep within him, something he'd long thought hidden. He felt a sudden chill wash over him, far colder than the autumn air, like fingers of ice curling around his heart. He took a step back, eyes wide, and in that single moment, she was gone, swallowed by the fog, leaving nothing behind but the dim echo of his own voice in the stillness. The town dismissed his tale at first, brushing it off as the imaginings of a man whose years had begun to blur the lines between memory and myth. But then the children began to appear more frequently, each one stranger than the last. They emerged from the mists, standing alone or in clusters, always silent, their faces blank, gazing with those unsettling eyes. No one could pinpoint where they came from, and no one ever saw them arrive. They were simply there. By the time the first frost lay over the fields, the children had spread throughout Coldwater, haunting street corners, lingering by the river, and gathering along the edge of the forest, like ghosts waiting for a place to rest. They came only at night, just as the stars blinked into view, slipping from shadows as if they were birthed from darkness itself. Every time a townsperson dared to get close, the children would stare with that same hollow, fathomless gaze, tilting their heads ever so slightly, their lips closed, never uttering a sound. The townsfolk, a superstitious lot, began to mutter among themselves. Some said they were spirits of children lost in the woods long ago. Others believed they were something else entirely, something not of this world. Their presence brought an air of quiet dread to Coldwater, a tension that stretched through the community like a thread pulled taut, humming with the electric promise of something terrible. Old Mr. Jensen, who lived at the edge of town, was the first to break that uneasy silence. He was a gentle, soft-spoken man who spent his days in his garden, talking to his tomatoes as if they were friends. One night, he spotted a girl standing by his garden gate. She was no older than 6, he guessed, her dark hair falling over her pale face in a curtain, her small frame draped in a thin, colorless dress that fluttered in the breeze. Her eyes, fixed on his house, were deep pools of darkness, reflecting nothing of the world around her. With a sigh, Jensen had stepped forward, hobbling slightly, and called to her, his voice as warm as the crackling fire in his hearth. "Do you need help, child? Are you lost?" She made no move, only watched him with that unsettling stare, her eyes gleaming in the dim light like polished stones. He reached out, intending to touch her shoulder, to lead her to safety. As his fingers brushed the fabric of her dress, a cold shock traveled up his arm, so sharp it felt as if he'd plunged his hand into freezing water. He gasped, stumbling back. The girl's eyes seemed to deepen, her gaze locking onto his with a fierce intensity that made his heart stutter in his chest. His mouth moved, forming words, but no sound came out. And then, just like that, she was gone. The only trace of her presence was a faint indentation in the frost-covered grass, as though she'd been rooted there like a weed. The next morning, Jensen's house was found empty, his bed neatly made, a faint chill lingering in the air as if the warmth had been leached from the very walls. His neighbors searched the woods, the riverbank, but there was no trace of him. Only the soft, strange imprints of bare feet in the frost, leading toward the forest and vanishing among the trees. The disappearances continued, each one casting a darker shadow over the town. People whispered of Mrs. Callahan, who'd been last seen berating two of the children at her back fence, demanding to know where they lived. Her voice, sharp and insistent, had echoed into the night. By morning, her house lay still and empty, her door left open to the wind. Townsfolk said that when they looked closely, they could see small, thin footprints pressed into the soil of her garden, prints that led only out, never back. Fearing what they could not understand, the townspeople grew cautious, locking their doors, shuttering their windows. By nightfall, the town fell into a hushed, waiting silence, as though bracing for something unknown. The children continued to appear, more of them each night, their faces blank, watching from doorways and alleyways, from the edges of the forest where the trees stood like silent sentinels. A few dared to speak to them, compelled by a curiosity tinged with dread. They asked the children their names, where they came from, why they wandered alone in the dark. But the children never responded. They only stood there, their heads tilting in that peculiar bird-like way, as if listening to something only they could hear, some whisper carried on the wind from a place beyond the reach of the living. Those who touched them, those who dared to look too closely, found themselves lost to the town, their lives stripped away as if by some invisible hand. One cold, cloudless night, Alma Collins, known for her boldness, decided she'd had enough of the mystery. Gripping a lantern, she followed one of the children. A boy, thin and frail, his skin pale as moonlight, as he drifted toward the forest edge. She walked in silence, her breath forming small clouds in the air, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. The boy moved slowly, his steps light, his figure slipping in and out of the shadows cast by the trees. Just as she reached out, intending to demand he reveal his secrets, the boy stopped. Slowly, he turned to her, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes pools of darkness, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. He whispered her name in a voice soft as a sigh, though she hadn't spoken it aloud. Alma's scream tore through the night, but by morning, when people came looking, they found her lying at the edge of the forest, her eyes wide and vacant, staring up at a sky that offered no comfort. She was alive but empty, her mind hollowed out, her voice lost to whatever had looked back at her from the depths of those dark eyes. From that night on, the townspeople learned to pretend they did not see the children. They ignored the strange shapes lurking at the edges of their vision, closed their ears to the distant, disembodied whispers that drifted on the night air. They forbade their own children from straying past the doorsteps after dark, shut their windows tight, and lived in constant fear of the dark-eyed figures that haunted their town. No one dared to leave Coldwater. The whispering seemed to bind them to the place, like a spell woven from fog and fear. And the children, those pale, silent children, continued to come, their numbers growing, their faces unchanged, unblinking, watching Coldwater with that endless, hollow gaze. They waited in the shadows, as constant as the stars above, as inevitable as the creeping night, their eyes fixed on a world that grew quieter, emptier, with each passing season. In time, Coldwater itself seemed to fade, the streets emptying, the homes falling silent, the voices of its people swallowed by the endless, watching dark. The townsfolk left behind moved like shadows themselves, silent and withdrawn, bound to a place that no longer felt like home. And so Coldwater remains, a place of empty houses and whispering trees, where shadows linger in the twilight, and dark-eyed children wait patiently for the night when they, too, will claim it as their own. Thank you for joining me on this eerie journey into the shadowed town of Coldwater and the mystery of the children who haunt its nights. If you enjoyed the story and want to hear more tales of the strange and unexplained, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Let me know your thoughts on the children of Coldwater in the comments below. Do you think they're spirits? something otherworldly, or perhaps something even darker. And if you have a spine-chilling story you'd like me to cover, feel free to share it in the comments or send me a message. Thanks for watching, and remember, when night falls, keep an eye out for shadows in the fog. You never know what might be watching back. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.